Hey everyone, I'm Eduardo Nared and welcome to my channel. Before we get started, don't forget to give me a subscribe, and of course you can like this video by clicking the thumbs up button if you enjoy my content. So welcome to another episode in my video series, The News Explained, where I take stories and issues going on in the news that I feel like aren't being covered properly by the mainstream media. Maybe they're leaving certain facts out, maybe they are misrepresenting the story, or in the case of this week, ignoring certain stories altogether. And so this week I want to touch upon two stories. Again, one which is being, I think, completely ignored by the media, and another one which is really being misrepresented. So first up, the story involving Mahmoud Khalil. That's the name of the Columbia University student that President Trump just ordered his administration to deport, in line with his executive order to clamp down on anti-Semitism on college campuses. So obviously this story immediately has a lot of angles. It's an immigration story, it's an Israel and anti-Semitism story, it's a foreign policy story, it's even a free speech story. The left is upset about it, obviously, for a ton of reasons, but even some people on the right are concerned about the free speech implications on college campuses here. I want to cover all of those angles in an honest and fair way, but before I do that, I want to tell you what the media is saying about this story and why they're getting it wrong. Let's start at the beginning. A few days ago, ICE agents arrested Mahmoud Khalil. He's a Palestinian in this country as a legal immigrant, and they arrested him from his apartment on the Upper West Side of New York. He's a student at Columbia University. Now, the Trump administration justified Khalil's arrest by saying that Khalil, quote, led activities aligned to Hamas, which is, of course, a U.S. designated terror organization. Well, how did Khalil do that? Well, for one, he was reportedly a major player in the Columbia University protests that swept the campus last year when radical students decided to shut down the campus to protest Israel's actions in Gaza. Khalil was part of a group called Apartheid Divest, which is basically a radical, run-of-the-mill far-left group on campus. If you've been on a college campus in the last 10 years, you will kind of know who these people are and what they are like involved in these far-left groups. I mean, in my experience, they're often Marxist, Islamic extremists, and sympathizers. This group in particular at Columbia put out a statement saying it defends, quote, liberation by any means necessary, including armed resistance against Israel. That is a tacit endorsement of what Hamas, again a terrorist group, did when they killed hundreds of Israeli citizens. So what else has this group done on campus? Well, that's where it gets a little tricky. As with any form of protest, including January 6th, for example, that's one that comes to mind, there are examples of constitutionally protected speech, peaceful aspects of certain protests, like holding signs and things of that nature, which are okay. That's fine. I don't object to any of those forms of protest. But oftentimes in this protest, there are other elements to these things. So on the one hand, when there couldn't be peaceful aspects to things, maybe here on the other side or not too far away, you have examples of things that breach what is constitutionally protected speech. Sometimes it's very shocking behavior. And I think that's what we saw with some of these campus protests. They turned violent. So this group in particular, Apartheid on Columbia University, they encouraged their followers to take over buildings on campus. This group did that. They encouraged their followers to take over buildings on Columbia University campus. They called it a sit-in, whatever euphemism they wanted to use for it, but they were basically taking over private property, obstructing and preventing other students from engaging in learning. That's against the law, full stop. It's a civil rights violation, and there should be zero tolerance for that type of behavior. That is not free speech. And last year, their efforts basically worked. These radicals took over Columbia University, and the school basically caved to them and moved learning online for a couple weeks. They didn't want to deal with these students. They wanted to negotiate with them. It was pathetic. So back to Khalil. Where is he involved in all of this and what happened at Columbia? Well, he was a lead negotiator between this group, Apartheid, and Columbia University when the school was trying to work with protesters to end these encampments. Now, at the very minimum, it's fair to say that Khalil was working for and organizing for a group that has openly defended a terrorist organization. There is no disputing that. And that to me is enough alone to justify President Trump's actions to deport him. And there are other allegations here at play. There's other concerns, and so we're going to address those. But again, I think on that basis alone, that's enough to deport him. But for the purposes of accuracy and addressing those other concerns, let's pretend that that is the bare minimum of what he did. The Trump administration is alleging there may have been other examples of him supporting terrorist groups. They so far have not released that evidence. And I don't want to conflate the actions of Khalil with maybe other people and what they did on campus, because that's not really relevant here. We're talking about what this specific individual did in this case. So regardless of any of the speculation based on what he may have done, what is still to be released about what Mahmoud Khalil did, let's make one thing very clear. Mahmoud Khalil was a lowlife. Again, that's just basing off the information that we know right now. And separate of the fact that he does have a legal right to protest in this country, we as a country shouldn't tolerate his behavior. We shouldn't tolerate behavior from people like this that we have graciously welcomed into our country. We have the right to say, actually, no thanks. Actually, we don't want people agitating here. We don't want people here aligning themselves with terrorist groups. The door's right over there, and we will gladly send you out. And now, in response to all of this, the media, the Democrats, they're melting down. They're saying, oh, the First Amendment is under attack. That even immigrants in this country have a right to free speech, which, by the way, of course, that is legally true. And so they're using that to condemn Trump's actions. And so let me address these attacks on the issue of free speech. Number one, their concerns are fake, okay? I'm not going to allow someone like Rashida Tlaib or Ilhan Omar, two members of Congress whose history in this country is very recent, lecture me on what the First Amendment is. I'm not going to allow the Democrat Party and the mainstream media that don't care about the First Amendment at all to now let them use the idea of free speech, an issue I deeply care about and many other Americans deeply care about. I'm not going to allow them to use that against us. I mean, in the case of this Rashida Tlaib person, oh, you really care about free speech? When was the last time, Rashida Tlaib, that you demanded, I don't know, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Iran, or China? When was the last time you demanded those countries allow visitors and guests in their country engage in political protest? Have you fought for the right of people to protest Hamas in Gaza? Is that one of your core beliefs, Rashida Tlaib? She would never do that. She would never call for Hamas to allow free speech rights in Gaza. I mean, if she cared about that, she would have done so already. And like I said before, the same thing goes for the media. We're now supposed to believe they all have a newfound concern for free speech in this country when they have basically endorsed censorship in all of its forms on social media, in person, in the classroom, wherever it may be, for the last 2 decades. I mean, as one example, where were these media outlets when innocent pro-lifers were being arrested and charged for peacefully protesting outside of abortion clinics? Where were they when the Biden administration jailed a man named Douglas Mackey literally for just posting an internet meme online? I'm not kidding. They jailed this guy. These are the same people who defended the targeting and prosecution of hundreds of regular Americans who committed no violence on January 6th, simply because they were on Capitol grounds during a protest where, on the other side of the building, things became violent. So you want to know what my response is to these people who now want to lecture us about free speech? Up yours. Where were you when all of these people were being targeted? Where were you when free speech was being attacked by the Biden administration during COVID, or all of any of those other examples that I cited? So I'm not about to hear a lecture from these people on free speech and the First Amendment, and neither should any of you. These people are not engaging in good faith. Now, on the other hand, there are some individuals, people on the left and right, people like Glenn Greenwald and others, who I believe are sincere and consistent in their support for free speech. There's some people on the right, actually, who are criticizing these deportation for issues that don't even have to do with speech. They're saying that Trump should be prioritizing his mass deportations of illegal immigrants as promised, as opposed to deporting someone who is anti-Israel. And those are fair critiques. I deeply care about the issue of free speech in this country. It's one of my core beliefs. We are the only country in the world that allows anyone to say anything short of slander, libel, defamation, things of that nature. But basically, if you're not doing that, no matter how offensive your speech is, no matter who you are offending, no matter how objectionable your speech is, it has generally been allowed in this country. Go look at Europe. In the UK, for example, you can be jailed for a social media post. And I know I just said that that happened under Biden too. He was trying to change that. But generally in this country, and this is part of why he lost, there is a strong sentiment and support for the First Amendment. I feel that I am a true free speech absolutist. So when I see the story, and when I see people that I care about and I follow expressing free speech concerns, I myself had this internal debate of how I felt about Mahmoud Khalil's deportation. But upon further deliberating and upon thinking about all the issues here at play, the issue of speech, the issues of immigration, I do believe that Americans can support Mahmoud Khalil's deportation while still being consistent with their views on the First Amendment. And the way that I do that, the way I look at this situation is very simple. Let's strip aside all the allegations and all the evidence against Mahmoud Khalil for a moment. Let's forget the pro or anti-Israel aspect in this equation, and let's focus on his immigration status instead. And I made this point on a recent appearance on Real America's Voice, which you can check out on my channel. And what I argued was, at the most basic level, if you welcomed a guest into your home, what would the reaction be if that guest started lecturing you about how you ran your home? What if they started attacking you for the rules you have for you or your children? Or what if they started criticizing how you conduct yourself in and outside of your home, about what friends you keep and what you do for a living, or what you do for hobbies? Most people would be rightly offended by that. And that's because it's offensive. It's arrogant to do that, and it would not be welcome in most households. And in the same way that none of us would tolerate that behavior in our own homes, why should we be tolerating this behavior from immigrants in our country? Why should you, Mahmoud Khalil, and others like you be allowed to come into our country because of our generosity from your dumpy third world countries where people have no rights whatsoever? Why should we allow you to then turn around and lecture us and protest our government and engage in political activism against us? And again, that's assuming that's the bare minimum of what he did, that he only engaged in protests that were constitutionally protected. He may have done way worse than that. I've been very consistent on this for many years, even about immigrants who are politically conservative, who may agree with me. I have said publicly that these people should not be engaging. If you are a guest in a country, if you are not a citizen, you should not be engaging in political activism. It's simple. Keep your thoughts to yourself. You're new here. You're not an American. Don't tell us how to run our country. I mean, this issue really pisses me off because who do these people think they are? This is not your country. And by the way, I'm not sure this is what the founding fathers would have intended either. I mean, inviting non-citizens from around the world, imagine if they would have done that in the early decades of American history, inviting people from all over the world, the only country in the world at that time and still today that has many of the freedoms that we do. So it still applies back then. Imagine if they would have done that, only for these non-citizens to protest against their newfound way of life and their newfound system of government and the freedoms they had created. What if people from all around the world came here and immediately started trying to undo or use those new freedoms against the young American government? Would they have tolerated that? Most countries in the world wouldn't tolerate that. What other country in the world allows this type of behavior? In what other country in the world could you be a guest in and then engage in protests? I mean, there's a reason why other countries don't tolerate this. I wouldn't dream of going to another country, by the way. Even in Europe, I visit Europe, I visit Latin America, I visit other countries. I wouldn't dream of going to any of these countries and think of protesting their policies. It is simply just not appropriate, like at a basic level. And I believe my view is consistent with the First Amendment. I have no problem with anyone espousing any view they want. Again, you can be pro-Israel. Great. You want to be anti-Israel? You're allowed to do that. You're allowed to hold any opinion you want in this country, no matter how much I or others may disagree with it. I don't believe on clamping down on any speech simply because it's unpopular or insulting to a particular group. But what I don't think should be allowed anymore is this idea that people can come from all over the world and then protest our country and our way of life when they aren't even citizens, much less shut down an entire university and affect the kids who are trying to study at that university in the way that Mahmoud Khalil did. And again, I understand the courts have ruled the way they have. I understand that legally immigrants do have a right to engage in this type of protest. I get that. I am simply arguing that they shouldn't have that right. And again, I'm not going to shed a tear for Mahmoud Khalil. I'm not going to engage with these people who haven't cared about free speech at all in the last 10 years. I'm not going to let them use my beliefs and my principles against me. These people don't care about free speech, not the pro-Hamas or pro-Palestine protesters on campus, and not the Democratic Party. What they are doing is using our cherished freedoms that we have in the West and using it against our society to push their own radical agenda. And by the way, these pro-Hamas protesters, why don't you try exercising your free speech rights back in the Middle East? Go back to your home countries and try protesting there. Let me know how that works out for you. Let me know how the idea of free speech that you care so deeply about works for you back home. And that's the real hypocrisy here, which in a way connects us to our second story, which is about what is happening in Syria. These same students on college campuses who have for the last year and a half since October 7th have been telling us that they're not against the Jewish people, they're just terrified and horrified about what they've seen done to women and children, and they care so deeply about humanity and about killing women and children. Have you heard these students make a peep about what is happening in Syria? Have you seen any protests on any campuses about the slaughter of Christians and other religious minorities in Syria? No. That's because these people don't really care about the deaths of women and children. It's fake. It's selective outrage. And most Americans don't even know this is happening either. You probably haven't even heard about this in the news, which to me is so shameful and so sad. It's an indictment on our media and our country, really. It's one of those wake-up moments for me as an adult when you realize the world doesn't work the way you thought it did. Things aren't the way you thought they were. The good guys in the world, people who profess, maybe people who even share your faiths, so-called Christians who profess to care about certain things, about good and evil, they're nowhere to be found in this issue. And I could spend hours on this topic. It's so deep and so complex, but I'm going to try to keep it simple and really get to what is happening there. So a few months ago, right before Christmas, a radical jihadist terrorist group that our media and our government treated and labeled moderate freedom fighters, they called these people moderate, overthrew the regime of Bashar al-Assad. Now, Assad had ruled the country for many, many years as a Shia Muslim. He was a dictator. And you often hear politicians in this country screech against dictatorship and dictators. We have to be for democracies and democratic countries because dictators are inherently bad, right? And look, I'm not defending Assad or the form of dictatorship as an ideal form of government, but the reality is, if you want to be an adult about understanding the way the world works, the reality is, and again, you won't often hear this, is that in many parts of the world, the Middle East being one of them, you need dictators. democracy actually doesn't work in these places. Democracy requires an educated populace in which people buy into democratic values and equal rights. Those beliefs, or at least understanding them, have been a vital part of Western heritage for centuries. It is innate in Western peoples. These things that we understand as normal in our culture and our society come naturally to us because our people, our ancestors, have been doing it for centuries. Not so in other areas of the world, in some of these other areas. So this false idea that we can just parade around the world and force people to accept our system of government is a joke. This idea was discredited over the last 20 years in Iraq and Afghanistan, you name it. Look at Libya. We removed that country's dictator, Gaddafi, and now that country doesn't even have a government. It's run by terrorists. Slaves are literally traded on the streets there. It isn't a country. So I'm against, actually, everyone that the media wants to call a dictator, and I'm not going to reflexively be opposed to someone that the media says we should be angry about because they're a dictator. Because in recent years, if you look at the recent history, the alternative to these so-called dictators has been far, far worse. And that is what's happening in Syria right now. In the case of Assad, I'm not arguing he was a good guy, or he was a moral guy, or he was a leader who should be celebrated. He wasn't someone who espoused the ideals of liberal democracy. But he did keep control of an unstable country with many religious and ethnic factions. The Alawites, for example, minority Christian groups. He protected them in the face of genocidal Islamic extremists. That's just true. I mean, you don't have to like Assad to admit that, but it's a fact. And yet, for some reason, over a decade ago, the Obama administration decided it would be a good idea to get rid of Assad because democracy, right? Democracy. Let's get rid of this guy. In fact, his administration actually sided with al-Qaeda to do so. There's this famous email from Obama's Assistant National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, who of course famously went on to be Biden's National Security Advisor last term. There's a famous email from him to Hillary Clinton saying, quote, AQ, meaning al-Qaeda, is on our side in Syria. AQ, they're on al-Qaeda, they're on our side. Obama ended up spending $500 million training these so-called moderate Syrian rebels. They're just moderates, right? They just agree with us. They just don't like living under a dictatorship, is what we were told. And most of them were Islamic terrorists. And we funded them and we supported them to overthrow Assad's government. It was an operation called Timber Sycamore. If you don't believe me, you can look it up. Obama and the neocons who supported him didn't care about the end result of what removing Assad would be. And now we're finally starting to see what that is. Now, again in December, a literal terrorist group, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, took over the country. And now that terror group and its leader, Mohammed al-Jalani, are slaughtering Christians and other religious minorities by the hundreds, reportedly 1,500 in the last couple of days. They are beheading them, forcing them to crawl on their hands and knees before shooting them, and in some cases, even crucifying them. The New York Times has referred to all of this as unrest. You know, like the unrest you see in maybe a protest in the United States. It's just a little bit of civil unrest, slaughtering religious minorities. When Assad was removed, the media fawned over the victory for these Syrian freedom fighters. Josh Rogan, a Washington Post columnist, praised it, saying it was, quote, a homegrown movement. Syrians rose up to fight for their own rights. So Josh, how is that going? How do you feel about this homegrown movement now? You feeling good about it? You still support these guys? And it's not like any of this was a surprise, by the way. There have been people warning about this for years, people who aren't even necessarily experts on the subject. That's how obvious it was. People who I know personally, Tucker Carlson, Tulsi Gabbard. And for warning that this very thing would happen if Assad was removed, they were smeared and attacked as all the ridiculous name calls you have seen in the book. They're puppets of Vladimir Putin. They're defending Assad. They're terrorist dictator sympathizers. The whole thing is actually so offensive, especially in light of what is going on. And what's even worse is the silence of our media. Christians are without a doubt the most persecuted religion in the world. When something happens to Jews or Muslims, there is near universal outcry about it. There is nonstop coverage in the media. You hear relentless ad campaigns against anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. Our politicians speak about it nonstop. And yet supposedly Christian nations like our own, and the nations of Europe, can't be bothered to do the same, to react the same way when Christians are being slaughtered in the Middle East. And it's not just Syria, by the way. 70 Christians were beheaded in a church in Congo just a few weeks ago. Did you see that story? They were praying, 70 of them. Terrorist group, Islamic terrorists just walk in and behead them. And frankly, it bothers me as a Christian that supposedly Christian conservative politicians, people like Mike Pence and Mike Johnson, can preach incessantly about the importance of standing with Israel and Jews around the world because of something that's said in the Bible. But they can't be bothered to say anything about people who are being persecuted, people who share their same faith. I don't understand it. It's really outrageous to me. And that's not to say that their views are Israel or wrong or that I disagree with them, but it's just, if you can say this about another religion, why is it so hard for you to say it about your own? They somehow feel it's their duty as Christians to do this, to speak out on behalf of other religions that are being persecuted, to stand strongly with Israel. I'm not against that, by the way. But it's fairly obvious that that issue is more important to them than the plight of their own fellow Christians around the world. To this day, Mike Johnson and Mike Pence and many other Christian leaders in the United States have not said a single word about what is happening to Christians in Syria. And it's bizarre. And it's bizarre that they can't do it for their own faith, especially when these people don't even have a voice. In other words, yes, it's great that they speak out for this group or that group, but those groups often have the power centers, the voices in the media to speak out on their behalf. Who is speaking out for Christians in Syria? And look, I'm not a Syrian expert. I would never claim to be. But this is just a bird's eye view of what is happening. And so if I can understand, if I can see this, if others can see it, it's something that you as Americans need to know about. We have spent, this is what it comes down to, we have spent our tax dollars to do this, to get rid of Assad, which is now leading to the slaughter of Christians. You paid for this. And our supposedly strong allies, Turkey, our NATO ally, Israel, another ally, they both played a role in this and they directly benefit from it. They are open about it. Benjamin Netanyahu couldn't hide the grin on his face the day Assad fell. He was posting this video online. And by the way, if I was Israeli or if I was an elected official for that country, I'd probably be happy about Assad's ouster too. I get it. It was probably, honestly, in Israel's interest, for many reasons, to get rid of Assad. I'm not mad that they think that way, but I'm mad at our American leaders who can't seem to understand that just because it was good for Netanyahu and Israel doesn't necessarily mean it's good for the United States or Christians around the world. And again, that we would use our tax dollars to do this is one of the most disgusting things that our government has been responsible for. And we shouldn't be afraid to talk about this or to say those things out loud. So anyway, I hope that gives you a sense a little bit about what is happening, again, from a bird's eye view. There's a lot more to this story, so I will continue to cover it as I see fit and hopefully bring you news and information you haven't heard before. But as always, thanks for watching this episode of The News Explained. Feel free to give my channel, again, a like, a subscribe, share it with your friends, subscribe to my Substack, thenaretfiles.com. All of these things are hugely important to me as I try to build my audience, and it helps me create more content like this. So thanks so much for watching. We'll see you next time.